Hey everybody, I'm Anthony Johnson. I'm here to talk about property tables. So property tables is a relatively new feature in FlexSim, but it's something that we're continuing to improve, and it's got a lot of power, a lot of flexibility in how you can define the objects, the object properties in your model. So anyway, I want to show a little presentation first, and then I'll go into FlexSim and show you some of the various features of property tables. Property tables, they allow you to increase the visibility of your model. You can not only set, but you can view and analyze the properties of whole populations of objects in your model. Some of the disadvantages of existing features, like copy from highlighted, oftentimes it didn't let you see exactly what you were changing a property from. So what if by copying to selected, you erase important work you've done on one or more specific objects? There was previously no good way to see what you were copying over. What if you accidentally changed a property on one or more objects, or you intentionally changed it, but later decided you didn't want that change? Often it's hard to know which objects you changed without visiting each object and seeing, okay, this is what I changed. It's also good for validating your model data. So using property tables, you can kind of slice and dice your visibility into your model. Using filters, sorting, etc. And that way you can verify what the object properties, what the object properties are and what they should be. The way property tables view your model is as if all of the objects in your model are a database table, and you can query that table, you can filter the table, you can sort the table. Each field represents a property on an object, and you can filter and sort by those fields, but also view each of those fields like a database table. It allows for batch editing, so you can easily view and change properties on whole populations of objects. And also it introduces some new capabilities for auto build and auto configure. So it integrates into table.query. So you can use an update clause when you call the table.query and update your objects table by setting certain properties on objects, and use filters with the update clause. You can also use the insert into clause. So if we're looking at this from the perspective of a database, when you call an insert into select or insert into query, it's adding rows into a given table. When your objects are your table, insert into will add objects into your table, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It's also programmable, so there's an object.setProperty method and an object.getProperty method, so you can programmatically set properties and get properties. Okay, this is just an example model that I'm going to use to kind of demonstrate some of the features of property tables. So this is a conveyor system. It's an overhead, a power and free conveyor system. Lots of conveyors in here. Not a huge model, but there's a good number of conveyors of objects in the model altogether. So it's a somewhat good example of how you might use property tables. So I'm going to go into my toolbox and add an object property table. So by default, when you add an object property table, you get two fields. One is the object, which gives you a reference to the object, and then the name field, which tells you the name of that object. Up at the top, there's several different buttons that you can use to configure this property table. Up the very first one that you will often use is the filter button. So you can filter on different properties. The other button is the columns. So this this is the set of columns that you want to see. So you can see that name is visible, but I can also check various different boxes and it will show me the properties of those different fields. And then finally, there's a sort button, and that will allow you to sort by different fields or properties. A default filter of a property table is two things. It says I'm only going to look at objects that are not a visual tool or a navigator. We figure you're probably not going to define properties of visual tools and navigators as much. So filter those out, but all other objects you can then see in this table. Each row represents a single object, and so I can see now all of my objects. Now, I may want to filter, I guess a perfect example here would be I just want to see conveyors, right? So if I look in here, I've got lots of different ones. I can see some decision points in here. So I want to filter those out. So what I do is I click on the filter button, I go to General, and I go Classes, and that adds a new filter in. And I say I want to have it be a conveyor. I only want to look at conveyors. And so conveyor in Classes. And that will filter out so that I will only see conveyors. Okay. Once I've done that, I can actually remove these other two filters because this filter, it accesses the primary filter for conveyors. So now once I see those conveyors, I can say, okay, what do I want to see? So I click on the columns. I say, I want to look at conveyors and I want to see whether or not what its speed is, maybe whether it's accumulating. I want to see its acceleration, deceleration, etc. Okay. So I can see for each one of these objects what that conveyor's speed is, whether or not it's accumulating. It looks like everything's accumulating and everybody has zero speed or zero acceleration or deceleration, so I can remove those things. You can select and change specific things. Individually, if I want to individually change a conveyor speed, I can just double click in that view and enter 5.4 or whatever, or I can enter, a speed of just 5. You can also batch edit. Okay, so if I select an entire group, I can click this drop-down button and it will show me what that top object's speed is. And if I change it, so I can change it to 7 and I click off, then that'll just change the top one. But if I select that entire set and I change it and say apply to all, or if I just, without changing it, just say apply to all, then it'll apply that speed to all of the objects that I've selected. Okay. So easy way to kind of quickly batch edit your various properties. Now, let me talk about some of the filters or some of the useful fields that you might use to filter. Okay. One of them, which we've already used, is classes. Let me actually show the classes field so that you can see exactly what the classes field is. So the classes field is an array of strings that represent all of the classes that a given object is an instance of. So conveyor 1 is an instance of this conveyor : straight conveyor, conveyor. It's also an abstract conveyor, FlexSim object, and FlexSim event handler. So that is all of the set of objects that object is a class or is an instance of. So what I can then do, by the fact that I have this array of strings, I can then filter out either more narrowly or I can filter out more broadly. So I could say I want to see everything that is a FlexSim object, right? So I could click on this and I say if FlexSim object, I wonder, is it in the dropdown? Okay, it's not in the dropdown, but you can just type in FlexSim object, and that will then filter by all objects that have this string in their classes field, or in other words, all objects that are instances of that FlexSim object class, right? So in this case, yeah, I want to filter by conveyor, which means the string conveyor : conveyor is in, or is one of the elements in the classes field, and that will give me all of my conveyors. So another one that's useful, I'll go ahead and remove that classes. Another one that's useful is groups. So let me again show you what this groups one is. Actually, I'll show you groups. The groups is an array of strings that are the names of the set of groups that an object is a member of. So for example, conveyor 33 is a member of the upper floor all group, the chain 9-4 group, and the chain 9 group. Okay. I can also click on this button. If I want to see where this object is in the model, I can click on it, and you can see it'll highlight it and center it in that view. I can zoom in. It looks like it's this guy right here. Let me click on that again. Yeah, so it's this guy. And again, you can right click. If I go to object groups, you can see that that is the set of groups that this guy is a member of. Upper floor all, chain 9-4, and chain 9. So how is that useful? Well, I can filter or sort by the group membership of an object. So I can say, I just want to go into groups and check that box. I just want to see the chain 9-4 group. And click off, and then it'll show me just those objects that are in that group. And then I can say, okay, well, all objects in this group, I want to have a speed of 7 meters per minute. And I apply that to all. You can also just click, if you've got multiple pages worth of objects, you can click on the top and it'll automatically show up. If you click on the top, it will apply that to, or at least it will select all of the rows of that set. So then you can set the speed on all of the objects. Another column that's useful is selected. This is useful for you to, one, be able to kind of see where your objects are. So if I click on this is selected, this is whether or not a given object is selected in red, right? So you can, if I zoom out, I could then select a group. You know what I'm actually going to do? I'm going to sort by the group. So I'm going to sort by the set of groups that an object is a member of. And I want to also see the groups that it's in so that I can see that it is indeed sorted. So now I'm not filtering by a group, but I'm kind of ordering those objects into the set of groups. Okay. Now, I can go in and say, I want to select everybody in this set of groups in chain 10-1, and I want to select them. So I say is selected and apply to all. And then I can go into my model and see exactly which objects those are. Which are the objects that are selected for that group. So it's essentially this set right here, right? So it allows you greater visibility. The other one that you can do in addition to, or as an alternative to is selected, is you could do, let me actually reset these guys back. You could do color. So if I go in and say I want to look at color, so go to visual, and then color, you can colorize certain sets. So I can go in and say, I want this set to be colored red. And then you can see, whoops, let me select everybody. Then apply to all. And then it'll show you, okay, that's the set of objects that are colored, right? So that you can use color to kind of categorize these things. So is selected and color are both very useful fields for kind of visualizing and seeing where your objects are in the model. The other thing that you can do with is selected is you can kind of go the other way around. If I want to view in my model, kind of go and look at things in my model and then quickly see their properties in the property table, I can filter by the is selected field or property. So I check that box, is selected, and I say where is selected is equal to 1. And then it will only show me those objects in the model that I have selected. So then I can very easily go in, click or select this set of objects, and then click back into the property table. Whenever I click back into the property table, it'll automatically update. You can also use this little refresh button if you want to explicitly refresh the table. But generally, you can just do that by clicking. So if I select here and then click in the property table, it will show me here are the objects that I have selected in that table. So again, it's a very easy way for you to see, visualize, or select objects in your model and visualize the properties of those objects in your model. There's also a set of what I call namespaced properties. So these are properties that you kind of, as a user, can define the names for. The most useful one would be labels, and the way that you use them is with this top panel here. Okay, there's 3 different types of. At this point, there are 3 different namespaced properties. One is labels, one is triggers, and one is AGV connections. So if I go into labels and I type in my label, and this is the filter, right? So I can, I can then add that as a filter, and I say I want to see all objects where the my label value, the value of the label named my label is equal to 1, right? So right now I'm not going to see anything, but then if I go in and change certain things or add that label to various objects in my model, set that to 1, then I go back in here and I take off the is selected, then you should be able to see all objects that have that label. And then I can view that label, so to see what its value is. So I can add more objects with that label. Now, additionally, I could just take that filter off, and I can set the label, my label, on multiple objects. So I could say, I want to set the label on all of these objects right here. Go up, enter, I want a label of value of 5, and then apply to all. So you can also automatically set label values through the property table. The other one is that you could do is triggers, right? Very useful are triggers. So I could have the on item bump trigger for conveyors. So I add that on item bump, and then I can go in, and for multiple objects again, I can go in and edit that trigger. So I can say control data, set a label on the object, etc. right? And then I apply that to all, and that will apply that trigger to all of those objects. So while I have added this property table from the toolbox menu, you can also add it through properties panes of various objects. So I can click on a conveyor, and over here you have all of the properties associated with conveyor behavior, with conveyor visuals. This little button in the properties pane allows you to create property tables from these set of properties. So if I click on here and I say create new property table, and then I can say, do I want basic conveyor properties, fixed interval movement properties, or slug builder properties? I'll just do basic conveyor properties. So if I do that, that will create a new property table that automatically has, it filters by the conveyor, but it also has all of those properties that you see, at least the basic conveyor behavior properties associated with this pane. Okay, so this is another way that you can very quickly create and edit property tables from the object panes, right? So I could also do that for a source. So if I wanted to see my source, all of my sources in my model, and then their various source properties, I could say create new property table, and that'll show me the various sources and their source properties. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the auto configure and auto build capabilities when using property tables. So I'm going to just start with a new model, and I'm going to drag out some objects. So just basically kind of a post office type model. Connect the objects up. All right, so I've got this object or this model. I'm going to add a property table. And in this property table, I want to see, I'm going to go down to spatial. I want to see location, size, rotation, and then I'm going to do this property which is out objects, which are the set of objects that you're connected to with your output ports. Okay. So you can see, here's the source one's location, size, rotation. He's connected to Q1 with his output port. Then Q1 is connected to 3 processors, so you can see those properties. Now what I want to do is I want to save this as a kind of configuration. So I can go over into the properties pane of this property table. I'm going to copy all of this data into a global table. So I'm going to call this table default config. And I hit the copy button. So copy this table to a global table. And it says, hey, this table doesn't exist yet. Do you want to create it? And I say, yes, create it. So this right here is just a direct copy from the property table to a global table. Okay. So now let's say I want to set up a different configuration. So let's say I take processor 3 out of it, move that off to the side, and instead of it being a parallel set of connections, I want this to be a set of connections that are done in series. So first go to processor 1, then go to processor 2, then go to the sink. And maybe I, change some rotations around, change the size, make this cube bigger, etc. Okay, then I click into this model or into the property table, and it automatically updates when I click in, and you can see that the out objects have updated based upon my new thing, my new configuration, and the location, size, and rotations have updated. So now I call this in series, and I copy that to a global table called in series. Again, it says, hey, do you want to create this table? And say yes. So now I've got a default configuration and an in series configuration, right? Which is the copy of that property table. So now I can actually switch between those two configurations. So the way that I do that is I use this panel right here. So update from global table, okay? And I'm going to say I want to update from default config. Now what it uses is it uses an update query. Again, it treats it integrates with table.query, and you can use FlexSim's SQL engine to do updates and other things. So what I hit this button to generate the update query. And this is technically a query that you can pass, this query right here, you can pass into table.query, and it'll essentially operate the same way. So notice I say update, and the table that I am updating is my objects table. So again, the objects in your model are viewed just as any database table. They just have this special syntax, which is objects, and then it's what's called a table valued function. So it takes a parentheses, open parentheses, but you update your objects. I give that object table an alias. I do an inner join on $1 as source. Okay, so $1 is going to be passed in by this property table as the default config. So it's doing an inner join on this property table, default config, and it's matching the objects table with, or in other words, the object in the model with the object column in this table. So when it sees source 1, it'll match it with this table, and then it will set, so it's inner joining on obj.object equals source.object, which is, right, the obj object is here, and then the source object is here. It's matching those two things, and when it finds a match, it updates the object's name based upon the source name, the object's location based upon the source location, etc. for each one of those things. So I've generated this query, and then now I can execute that query. So if I execute that query, then it will update all of those objects based upon that default config table. I can switch this to go back to the in series table and execute it, and it'll update based to that specific configuration. So this is very similar to our model layouts feature, although it is more flexible and more powerful. For example, I've included the set, in this case, I've included the set of out objects, right, which are the set of connections. So the model layouts feature will only save locations, sizes, rotations of objects. This feature can do essentially anything you want. Any property that is supported, you can save that property off and then restore it to, using these global table saving mechanisms. I can also set it up to be a kind of configuration for a parameter, a model parameter. So for example, I could go into my parameters table and I can set up a model config parameter, and then I say that is an option. I'm going to make it into an option, and there are going to be two options, which is default, and then the value for this option is going to be default config, and then I'm going to call this one in series, and this one will be in series. Okay, so the value for the given option, oops, I need to put it here. The value for the given option is going to be the table name, the name of the table that I want to import from. So once I've set that up, then I can go back into my table, and instead of updating from a specific table, I want to update from a parameter. The table that I update from is based upon that model config parameter. Okay, so parameter model config. And then if I check this box to update on reset, then it'll essentially run this query on reset, and this $1 will be, that it passes in, will be based upon whatever my model configuration is. So if I go in, I can go in now, reset my model, and it'll go to my default configuration, or I can click in here and say in series, hit reset, and it'll go to my in series configuration. So a pretty powerful feature for defining various model configurations. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some of the auto build capabilities that you can use with property tables. Oftentimes, you can have big warehousing models with lots of storage lanes, etc. And I built this model to kind of demonstrate some possibilities for what you might do. I've built a single storage lane, and then I've configured a property table as well as a query that essentially duplicates that lane across multiple different copies, such that if I then change the lane, I can then just hit a button and it'll update all of the other lanes. So if I hit this execute button, it creates a bunch of different storage lanes. But I can go in, maybe I want to change the radius of this path. Maybe I move these control points around a little bit. Let's see. There we go. And then I can re-execute that script or that query, and it'll update all of the other lanes based upon my changes. So, how does this work? What I've done is I've created a group, and I've added the set of objects that I want to copy to that group. So if you look, I have a group called intersection, okay? And all of the objects that I want to copy are part of that intersection group. And then I've created this table, this intersection objects property table, that filters by that group. So where intersection is in groups. Then what I've done is I've added properties like location X, location Y, and location Z. Is selected is not as important. Then once I've created that, then I want to say, how do I want to copy them? I want to copy each one of them, and then I want to offset the location for each of those copies. So whenever I create a copy of this guy, I want to offset his location by a certain amount that I can define. So that I've done in this global table called copies. Okay, and I've essentially created 5 rows where each copy has an offset X that is incremented by 5. Okay. So what that means is for this lane, I want to create 5 different copies. The first copy, I want it to be offset by -5 meters. Second copy, -10, etc. So once I've created that data, then I can go into my property table and I create this custom query. Now what I've done, instead of hitting the generate button, which would kind of generate an import query, I've just kind of piggybacked on the fact that this field right here is just a query that you can call by hitting this execute button. So I could copy and paste this query and use it with table.query, and it would do the same thing. So what am I doing? First of all, I need to make sure that I can delete, once I've created the copies, I need to make sure that I can delete each one of those after when I want to recreate it. So whenever I create a copy, I add a label called auto build and I give it a text which is intersection, right? And then once I want to delete it in order to refresh, I say delete from objects where the label, the auto build label, is equal to intersection. So this is going to, this first query is going, or this first statement is going to delete all objects that I previously created in a previous auto build. So once I've done that, then I have an insert into command. So again, since the objects table is, since the objects in my model I'm viewing as just a database table, if I implement a SQL statement that is insert into the objects table, that's actually creating new objects. Now, when you use the insert into objects command, there's one kind of important field that you have to define, which is the copy from field. So this is how it knows how to create that new object. It copies from some existing object. When you specify the insert into, here are the fields that you want to specify the values for the rows that you're inserting into. The first one is copy from. Then when I actually insert into, then I say the values that I want to insert into are defined by this select query. Okay, so the copy from, which is that first column, I want to be object.obj.object. Now notice when I select from intersection objects, which is this property table. As object, I give it the alias object, and then I interjoin that on copies. So what that means is for every row in this one, it'll go through each of the rows of this copies table. So for this row, it will create 5 copies. For this row, for the second row, it'll create 5 copies, and so on. But when it copies that, it looks at, when it creates the copy, it copies from this field right here, obj.object, which is this field in the property table. And then the other things that I want to set are the location.x, the location.y, location.z, and then the labels.autobuild field, which will set the label called autobuild on that created copy. And then finally, I want to make the groups member, or the groups property of the given object, I want it to be empty so that it does not, because all of my copies, when I create a copy, it'll actually create a copy of the membership in that group. And I don't want the new created copies to be part of this properties table. So once I've done that, and finally, I guess this value here is saying the labels.autobuild is going to have the value intersection for all of them. So that's what gives me this thing where I can later then delete from that, delete those objects that I've created. So that's essentially how it works. I can create it, and I can then execute this, and it'll delete all of the old ones that I've created and recreate them with the new configuration. Note also that when I set the location.x, right, the value for that location.x is this object's location, which is right here, plus the copy's offset x, which is right here. So I'm essentially incrementing whatever this location is by this value. So now I want to address something a little tricky about using this auto build mechanism. I've added a rack in with a connection to a control point. So this is one of the tricky things, is how do I duplicate the connections between objects when I'm doing this type of an auto build scenario? The most intuitive and unfortunately the incorrect way of doing it is you'd think, oh, well, I can just go in and say, well, let's look at this AGV connections.location. So then I can see the location connection for the control point and the rack. And then I could go and adjust my query to say I want to set the property AGV connections dot location, and then for the value I want to set it to whatever the object's AGV location connection is. So if I try doing that and hit execute, you notice it'll create all the copies. The problem is it just duplicates the connection of the original, so that the rack has the same connection to that control point as the original one, and the control point that is copied has the same connection to the original rack as the control point that he is copied from. So I don't want it that way. I want each individual copy to be connected to the control point. So instead of doing it that way, I'm going to remove this control point, or that column. Actually, I want to leave that in. What I've done instead is I want to use it to make it based upon a name. So I've added a column to the copies table called name prefix. And each one of these copies, every object that is copied should get a prefix for its name. And then I will reference the object by its name when I try to create the connection. Okay, so I've named each of my objects in lane 1, L1, P1, and then I've also added labels, a lane ID label, and then also a CP label. Okay, so the lane ID will be kind of the suffix, right? So you have the lane identifier and then the object identifier within that lane. The lane identifier would be defined by this copies mechanism, the name prefix, and then the suffix would be defined by this object, or by this property or this label. So when I go into my insert into, I add a new label or a new property that I want to set, and it's the name property, and the value for that name property is I want to say copies dot name prefix plus object dot labels dot lane ID. So that will it'll set the name of the copied objects to the name prefix of the copy right there, plus the lane ID of the individual object. So if I do that and execute it, let's take that comma off, take this off for now. Actually, I'll just leave this as an empty array for now. Okay, and I execute it, then now I've got each one of these guys named correctly. So lane 2 rack, lane 3 rack. This guy is CP3, lane 4 CP3, lane 3 CP3, lane 2 CP3, etc. So all of them are named. So now I want to set an AGV connections.location property, meaning the location connection for this rack to be CP3. And so the way that I've done that is I've added this labels this label to the rack called CP, and I've given it the value for that rack of CP3. And then once I do that, then I can go down here and I can say copies.name prefix. So I get the name prefix, so whatever lane I'm in, plus whatever object dot labels dot cp. So give me that labels CP value. If it's a null, then this will evaluate to null and it'll give me an empty array, so it can't resolve it. But if it is valid, then this will give me a valid array that will, with one element in it, that'll connect it up. So if I execute that, cross your fingers, and there you go. So now I have this object with, the connection up, the proper connection configuration. So I can easily, once I've set that up, I could easily say, well, what if I have 2 control points and 2 racks in here? I could very easily go in, just change lane 1. I can copy this guy, paste a new control point, copy this rack, paste him, connect him up to that new control point. Now when I copy and paste, it should add those in, because when I copy and paste it, it should be part of that group. Now this one, this new guy, I'm going to name him CP4. And his lane ID is going to be CP4. And then for this rack, actually I'm going to rename this to rack 1 and this one to rack 2. And then his lane ID should be, or his control point connection should be CP4. So then if I reset and run that or execute it, then it should create those with their objects connected up. So that's some of the features, the really powerful features associated with property tables. We're going to continue to add and hopefully make things easier to use. But I think, at this point it is very powerful. I should say some of the features that I've shown here in this example are not yet released, but they will be available in the 21.1 version, which should be out in April. So, thank you.